Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about Exchange servers. Are you still running your Exchange server in-house? It's going to be presented by our very own Ben Bolte. We are very excited to get started today. So I'll just mention quickly that we do record this and every webinar that we host. So you can always find those on our website later today, abc-computers.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question pane. I will call them out and get them answered for you. So without further ado, Ben, I will hand it over to you.
Alrighty. I'm assuming you can see my screen, Abby.
I sure can. Looks good.
Is that correct, Abby? You can see my screen?
I'm sorry, Ben. Yeah, my microphone didn't work there. Yes, I sure can see your screen.
All right. I just want to make sure before I start.
Yep.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to take a little time to talk about if you're still running Exchange server in-house, what things that might be going through your head about moving to the cloud and options that you have. So without further ado, we'll get started. So first we'll just do a short introduction here about ABC Computers. Some of you may be familiar with us and others might be new. We're an IT services company. We focus primarily on Microsoft Dynamics NAV and the associated infrastructure to support it. We work primarily in the upper Midwest, and as you can see, we have physical office locations in Waupaca, Wisconsin, Rhinelander, Wisconsin, which is where I'm from, on Alaska, or in the La Crosse area for those that are more familiar with that name, and the South Bend, Indiana. And then we have staff members located throughout those states and others also. Some of the customers that we work with that you might have some familiarity with are companies like Bulldog Battery, Culver's Ice Cream, Cat Plugs, Meps and Mr. Twister, Shep's Ice Cream, and Sears makes the bicycle racks and stuff, and also Lids, who makes a lot of the sports apparel and hats and stuff that you see at different stores. Just a little bit of an introduction about myself. My current role is a technology architect at ABC Computers. I've been here a little over 10 years now and been in the IT consulting world for a little over 22. I work with customers on a daily basis to try to help them figure out what direction they're trying to go from an IT perspective and what their goals and initiatives are, and trying to figure out how we can use the IT resource to help them get there. A lot of times it's cloud-based, sometimes it's on-premise, but that's what we kind of work around and try to figure out how to get them to meet their needs. So I kind of want to start with how we got here. You know, what led you to put Exchange in-house to begin with? And if we look back, there's really 4 areas where I see that drove most people to put an Exchange server in to begin with. Number 1 being better communication. Exchange lets you keep in touch by providing access through multiple devices, whether it's desktops, a web-based client, or a mobile device, that you'll get the same experience from each of the devices. Your inboxes are synced, your sent items are synced, and all those things, along with the ability to have contacts and public folders and some of those other features that some people use. And what we see drove a lot of customers to Exchange in the first place was when the mobile phone side really started kicking in place, and people would start sending messages from their phone, and when they got back to the office, they'd realize that sent message wasn't in their inbox or their sent items. They didn't have records to that. So you want to get that same experience everywhere. The second one's productivity. Being able to access all your information from anywhere really makes life a lot easier and more productive. There's nothing worse than when a client is working on their phone, they read all their messages, they get up to date, they go back to the office, and it looks like they have 30 new messages. When in reality, there's only been 2 that have come in since you've last checked your email. Just not having to paw through there and delete stuff duplicate times really helps streamline your day and make you more productive. The third thing being professional appearance. In today's world, if you have a company that doesn't have their own domain name, it has a reflection or projects a reflection about the company and how professional they may or may not be. And we've all dealt with it, I'm sure, at some point or another, where you're working with somebody, you're really impressed, and then they give you an email address at gmail.com, or maybe it's Frontier or some other hosted service. It doesn't help portray the image that you oftentimes are. And last but not least is better collaboration. Exchange isn't just for email. Although it's one of the large functions, you can also share documents, calendar, tasks, and other items within your organization to keep everyone working together better. So when I boil it down to me, like, what's the common thread? When I really look at the common thread, to me, it's like you're trying to get a more professional system and reliability. I mean, a lot of this is about image as much as it is anything. And the number one factor in my mind to having a professional image is to have a reliable system. It needs to be up all the time. You need to be able to access those type of things. And many of us, when we put Exchange servers in initially, it really wasn't that email was a primary communication method, but is one of the communication methods we had with customers. When we meet with customers now and we ask about, like, how do you work with your customers and your vendors, the number one thing that comes up almost every time is either email or phone, and those two flip-flop as which is number one and which is number two. That wasn't always the case, and being that it's one of the most common pieces for your communication criteria, that you can't afford it to be down. So it really starts echoing some of the, in my mind, advantages of a hosted Exchange system. So when we start looking at the advantages from a hosted Exchange system, to me it really breaks down to 7 key features. Number one being the financial investment. Going to a hosted system, you don't have to purchase the hardware, the software licensing, and all the maintenance costs that you would on a traditional on-premise solution. It also allows you to have a much more predictable expense. You know you're going to pay X number of dollars a month to have that service. And when you have an on-premise solution, you don't know when that next hard drive is going to fail, when the next upgrade your team's going to want will have a new feature that you need to put in. It's hard to plan around those things. Kind of building on it, is the IT resources in number 2. While Exchange is a fairly reliable solution and it runs well, it's not without some sort of involvement, whether it's an on-premise person that you have working your stuff, or if you have a consultant like ABC Computers or somebody else work on your system. It requires maintenance to keep it up. And if you've ever been blacklisted or something like that, you know how much of a pain it can be to get off of these lists so your email can get through to your customers and vendors. It's extremely time consuming, and it's nothing to spend 20 or 30 hours to try to get off a single blacklist. And it's easy enough to get on those type of lists. Deployment. One of the things that we see a lot when we're doing Exchange servers in the past is it's extremely costly to put them in, and it's expensive to migrate between platforms. So depending on the version that you're on, there may be features that have been removed or changed so that the complication can be more complex than the normal. All these things add up to making it a more expensive migration. It's not uncommon that the development of the new server is thousands of its own to get there. So one of the biggest features that I see is reliability and maintenance. In a hosted solution like Office 365, Microsoft guarantees a 99.95% uptime, and it's financially backed. Now, I've had this conversation with clients, and they'll say our exchange solution is up almost all the time too. And like, what's the advantage? If my internet's down, I can't get my email, and so I'm no different if I'm hosted or if I'm on premise. And while some of that's true, the argument I always have back is most customers have smartphones or can go work at another spot. And if your connection at your office is down, all your communications are still taking place, and you can still get that, whether it's on a mobile phone or whatever the device happens to be. And from a maintenance perspective, Microsoft has team members maintaining, doing upgrades, patches, and all that stuff 24/7, 365. And that's just, it's an uptime that the average person can't afford to do, and you certainly can't have the redundancy and all these type of things that they build in their systems to guarantee that type of uptime. Another area is security, and if you watch the news every night, you'll see it. Nobody is immune to security risk, whether it's the government, it's Target, or other companies. Everybody's getting hacked into at some point. It's just, and it seems like lately it's more of a matter of when than if. But the one thing I think that you can really rest secure with is the fact that with a data center like Microsoft's doing with their hosted stuff for Office 365, they meet all the compliance requirements that banks are required to do, that the Fed's required to do, and all these things. And on top of the security piece, to me, you know, that you have the risk from somebody hacking into your system. You also have the risk of just losing your data from a lack of a backup or a storm hitting your place. With Microsoft's data center, they're fully geo-redundant, so your data has multiple copies in multiple locations within the US, and all of that adds to give you a more secure solution. So the sixth bullet point is going through upgrades. As we kind of touched on earlier, upgrades are a painful process. Sometimes you can get away with just installing a software upgrade, but sometimes you have to replace hardware or upgrade between versions of the software that requires new hardware and operating systems. All this increases the cost and complexity, and oftentimes means downtime in between. With a hosted solution, all of that's handled in the background, and while they're doing an upgrade in one data center, you continue to function in the other, and then they will shut down the redundant side and flip you over so that you continue to have the uptime that they're guaranteeing. It really makes life easier from the end user perspective. And last but not least, they provide 27 or 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 support. If you're like me, every time something breaks, it's at the time when it's absolutely most unfortunate, for lack of a better way of putting it. The stuff never breaks at 4 o'clock on a Monday. It breaks at 4 o'clock on a Friday when you got to get that urgent email out. And what happens is your IT guy's gone home for the day or whatever. You don't have dedicated support to get that back up. In a hosted environment like with Office 365, Microsoft has staff members on working on the stuff 24/7. And if there's anything that goes wrong, they're going to resolve it and it'll be back up shortly. When you combine all of these things together, there's some huge advantages. And on top of that, it typically is even cheaper than running it on premise yourself. So when we look at all the advantages, it seems to most customers, like when we lay out the numbers, that it makes sense to make a migration. But then the question always comes up with, like, how painful is the migration? How do we get there? And depending on the documentation you read, some will say it's the easiest thing ever, and some will say it's extremely complex and there's a lot of risk involved. And the truth lies somewhere in between, actually. At ABC Computers, one of the things that we do is we like to take the time and do what we call an exchange risk assessment. So we have a report that we run that'll go through it, and it runs a whole bunch of different areas. And we're going to highlight some of the areas that it looks at, because part of doing any migration is to know what you need to move and what you're trying to replicate, and also take out what you don't need, because if you're not using it, or there's no use to migrate it and then deal with it through the next upgrade cycle. And whether it's an ERP system or a mail application, it's the same type of thing. If you don't need it and you can get rid of it, it simplifies it going down the road. So we go through a bunch of different things in our assessment. We look at the Exchange server and document the properties of it. We go through the mailboxes and we do the same from that perspective. Then we go through the user properties and mailbox permissions, retention policies, and all these type of things to try to figure out what we have to replicate when we move it to a hosted platform. And we're going to take a little time and try to dive into this to kind of explain and show you what we do. Then we'll walk through the migration process. So when we do the first piece, we document what kind of server it is. And I ran a sample report here, and this is on a 365 environment. So it'll tell you that it's in Office 365, gives you the version number of Exchange. And this particular one tells you what plan you're on, because I did it on a hosted environment. But it'll give you all the detail about the number of mailboxes you're using, how much storage it's using, number of distribution list, the number of policies from a retention perspective, because all this stuff needs to match when you migrate, or you're going to end up losing data that you wanted. Then the assessment report will also give you like a list of the top mailboxes and how much space they're actually using by user. And then we'll get a detailed list of each of the users, what their quota is, how much is used, the percentage of space that they're using. All this helps us define what's going to be involved, how much time it's going to take to migrate, and make sure that what we're migrating is the data you really want. Oftentimes what we find is if you have an organization that has 50 legit users, there's probably 75 or so in your Exchange server, because what happens when employees come and go, you might disable the account, you might not, you might want to keep it, that alias, and depending upon who is managing the Exchange server, those type of things get handled differently. And it ends up with you have a lot more accounts than what you really generally need, but there might be some data or something that you're looking for, and there's a reason for it, but we work through those things as we gather the details. So the next thing that we like to look at is traffic and use reports. This kind of gives us an idea of how much is going on in and out of your environment. And what we find typically is there's an awful lot of email going in and out in an environment. And a lot of that comes down to is if you have an Exchange server in-house, you might be using an on-premise spam filter. Now, depending on the statistics that you read, they vary all over the place. And depending on domain name, it has a huge factor in how much spam you get also. But like at ABC Computers, we've had a domain name that's been around for almost ever, it seems like. And like in our environment, we get about 200 legit emails an hour. But we also get, when you look at the reports, about 18,000 spam messages an hour. So when we went from an on-prem to a hosted solution, by being able to remove all that spam and getting it out of the environment before it hits us, it really took a load off of how much internet traffic we're doing, which initially, it gives you that feeling that you had a lot more bandwidth than what you really, or you feel like you got a big bandwidth increase even though you didn't, just because you freed it up by not receiving all the stuff that you don't need every hour. And then this also gives you an idea of how much retention policies you have in place, or how much data is sitting in what area, like how old the data is that you have. Another really neat feature is we get a mobile device report. So one of the things when you're doing a migration is you need to be able to explain to users what they're going to have to do on their devices so that they can make sure they continue to receive email after you make a switch to a hosted solution. This report is really handy from our perspective because it goes through and tells us these are all the devices and each version of the iPhone or whatever devices that are connecting. So you can give appropriate instructions and to make it easier from a user perspective. And then the opposite side of it is it gives you also the OS. So like in our environment here, you can see there's some iOS stuff, there's some Android, there's Windows Phone, and all the different versions of Android OSs that we'd have to worry about. And then on top of that, another piece that's really nice from a security perspective and a knowledge perspective is you can look at each user and what device they're connecting with, or if they have multiple devices connecting. So in our example here, there's some users that have multiple devices connecting, and you'll see in some cases that it appears like a phone was replaced because one date stopped and then basically the next device started when its sync pattern was. And some of those cases just needs to be cleaned up, or should be cleaned up. In other cases, it's legit that the user has multiple devices they're syncing with. The other big piece is trying to figure out distribution lists. So in most companies, you'll have a generic email address, whether it's support or info at or something like that off of your website or sales, and those are going to multiple people and trying to figure out how those distribution groups are set up. Because when you migrate, we want this to be as seamless as possible. So this tool will go through and give us all the distribution lists that you have and who the members are of each of them. The next piece that you have to replicate when you do Exchange migration is permissions from a Mailbox perspective. So if you're familiar with Outlook and you have a lot of subfolders, whatever, you may or may not realize that you can share folders, parts of folders or all of them, and depending on permissions, if you want them to go to everybody or just some people, well, the report that we run on our assessment will go through and detail all that. Because when you migrate, you got to keep the interruptions down from a user perspective. This gives us all the details that the replication, when it takes place, will carry all those permissions over to the next users. Then we also get a Mailbox detail report, which is a handy piece because it'll give you information that you don't normally see. So it gets you Mailbox information by size, what the quota is set on it. It tells you where the archive warnings are at. So in this particular example, there's a 100 gig quota set on the archive mailbox, and they want to give the warning to a user at 90 gig. So it gives you all that information so we can replicate it to your new environment if necessary. So all those things combined together gives us everything we need to move it forward. The other piece I didn't have a snapshot of was it'll go through public folders, because some companies, depending on how long you've been on Exchange, may use a lot of public folders. And depending on the version of Exchange, it kind of went away in 2010 from an Exchange environment, and then it kind of came back. So there's some trick to how to migrate some of those, but we also get a detailed list of those folders and how to move that stuff forward. So the question we get asked a lot is, how does the migration process actually take place? Because it is a critical system, customers don't want to be down without email. So what we normally do is we go through that whole assessment process and we'll work with the customer to determine all the pieces that they do want to move over and those that they don't. Then there's a tool that we use that will install a client on each user's PC that's provided by a company called Skykick. What that tool does is it allows us to change all of your Outlook settings at the appropriate time when we need to, because you're going to have a new profile that says you need to go to Office 365 or whatever the hosted solution is instead of your local on-premise server. So once that tool's installed, there's a sync process that takes place, and it will take a copy of everybody's mailbox and move it to Office 365 prior to the migration, or I should say the go live of the migration. So that initial sync takes place, and that, depending upon the number of users, your internet connection, and all those things, it can take as little as a day or two. And I've seen some cases where it's taken closer to a month, where they had a slow connection and they've been on Exchange for a lot of users for a long period of time. So once that initial sync gets done, we then have a date that you can cut over for the migration. So typically speaking, we'll do a migration on a Friday, like around at 5 o'clock or something like that, like the end of business day. So there's two pieces that come into play from a customer perspective or outside user perspective. One being you have an MX record that you have to change, so that's going to tell your mail to go from or stop flowing to your current email server, and it needs to start going to the other hosted server. So when that record changes, there's a propagation delay for DNS. So typically speaking, it can take as little as minutes, or depending upon the DNS servers at your clients or other people, it can take as much as 72 hours. Usually somewhere in that ballpark. During that time, email might flow to your old server and it might flow to your new server. So what our tool does, the Skykick tool, is it'll actually go in and synchronize those servers again, so you can go in and start working in your new environment, and any emails that happen to flow over to your old server, it'll do a sweep and swing those over to Office 365 so you don't miss any emails along that time frame. Now there'll be a slight delay in how long it takes for your email. It won't be as instant as it would be once the DNS is completely swung, but there is a little bit of a delay there. But from a client perspective, if you have somebody working at their desk, they're going to see a little pop-up window in the lower corner of their monitor that says, your company's decided to do a migration to Office 365. At this time, we need to close Outlook and change your settings. Once we're done, we'll prompt you and you can reopen Outlook. So Outlook will close and they hit OK. In the background, what happens is the Skykick tool goes in and it actually changes the settings on your Outlook profile to now point to the Exchange server that's in the cloud versus your on-premise one, and then it will prompt you that you can reopen Outlook. When you reopen Outlook, it'll look just like it did before because it is the same as it was before. The only difference is now you're opening it from Office 365 versus from your on-premise. Now, the question we get asked a lot is what happens if my user wasn't at their desk, they're on vacation, or it doesn't matter. If they come in 2 weeks from now, when they open it for the first time, it's going to prompt them the same thing, that your company's moved, we need to change the file on your machine. It'll update it, and then off it goes, you're synced back up. What'll happen from a mobile perspective, as we alluded to before, is you're going to get an email that'll say, now that your company's moved to Office 365, there's a new setup that's required. So you go onto your device, and most devices, all they ask for is an email address and a password. You type it in and it'll resynchronize to Office 365. So it's fairly painless from an end user perspective. The only thing they have to do at all themselves is reconnect their phone. And like I said, one of the things we do with the assessment is to figure out what OSs you have, which allows us to make it easier and send documented steps on how to do that for each of the operating systems that you're covering or phones that you're covering in your environment. So that's, in a nutshell, how the whole process takes place. I guess at this time I'll open up for questions and thank everyone for their time.
Okay, great, Ben. We do have a question here. How long does a typical project take from assessment through migration?
That's a great question. So typically speaking, the migration part of the project is usually a week or two, and the biggest factor is figuring out a time that'll work for you to do the and your employees so that you can communicate everything and to do the synchronization up to the hosted platform. Usually the slow or the fastest we'll see that happen is like a 3-day period, but typically it's more of like a week or two because people want to make sure everyone's up to speed and knows what's going on and make sure everyone's on the same page before they actually do it. The assessment piece we can run, it usually takes about an hour or so for the tool to run, and then it takes some time to go through the details, and depending on how large an environment is, if it's a 20 user environment, it doesn't take very long to work through the details with the customer. If you have 500 users, what typically we'll see is there's 600 or 700 accounts in there, and it takes longer to paw through the details. So the assessment piece is really variable. The other part really doesn't change a whole heck of a lot. Any other questions, Abby?
Yeah, actually. Here's our other question that we've gotten so far. Do I need to worry about data loss with a migration to hosted Exchange?
That's an interesting question. So I get asked this on almost every migration we sell, and I give the same answer to everyone else. The answer is no. And one of the really, I think, cool features that the tool that I mentioned earlier, the SkyKick tool provides, is that it gives you the ability to see your data, get comfortable with everything before you make the swing. We have some customers that, they, for lack of better terms, they're concerned and they use email a lot. They have a lot of stuff. And they get concerned, like, is everything going to be there? Is it going to be just like what I had? And then one of the cool pieces is, once the initial sync is done, you can log into your Office 365 account and see all your email, your calendars, all of that stuff prior to go live. So that really calms everyone's fears. And the other thing is, if you're really concerned, you always have the ability to make a PST backup locally. That would give you the extra comfort level, so to speak, if it was necessary. But that really hasn't been an issue ever. And for most customers, when they log in, can see it all before you swing the MX record. They really like that comfort level it gives them.
All right, great. Well, Ben, I will tell you those are all the questions that we have that have come in. I'll give people a couple more minutes here just in case there's any follow-up questions. In the meantime, I will remind everybody that this, along with every other webinar we do, is always recorded. So we will have that up on our website by the end of the day, abc-computers.com. And Ben, it looks like that is all of our questions. So thank you so much for that great presentation. I know that I'm a lot clearer on what it means to move this server into the cloud and what the benefits of that are. And I think that our attendees are a lot clearer on that as well.
All right, and as always, if somebody has questions later, whether it's a recording or it comes up afterwards, feel free to reach out to us. We're always here to help.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks to our attendees, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, bye.